Rail Innovations presents Canadian Steam in the 50s from the collection of W.H.N. Rossiter. Canadian Pacific P1 Class Mikado 5191 passes Campbellville, Ontario, with 4th Class Train 92 eastbound to Toronto. The date is October 14th, 1956, as G1 Class Pacific 2235 and H1 Class Hudson 2817 approach with westbound tonnage. The location is Campbellville, Ontario, on Canadian Pacific's Toronto to London Galt subdivision. Following closely on the block of our last train, two Pacifics work more tonnage west. Most westbound trains required assist engines between Toronto's Lambton Yard and Orrs Lake, 3 miles west of Galt. Here the assist engine would cut off and run light back to Lambton. Until diesels entered the scene, most of the assist engines were hand-fired 10-wheelers, Pacifics, and consolidations. Galt Junction is a busy train order and train register office where the mainline Galt subdivision is crossed by the Hamilton to Goderich line known as the Goderich sub. P1 Mikado 5178 is readying its train for a run south to Hamilton, while on the Galt sub, another Mike arrives with a caboose hop to London as Pacific 2318 looks on. .5178 is seen this time south of Guelph, en route to Hamilton. Note the red oak-colored cab door. This was an identifying feature of CP Western Line engines, but 5178 has been displaced by the encroaching diesels and is now assigned to Eastern lines. Mikado 5405 glistens in the fall sun as she heads west through Campbellville, shortly after her last ever Angus shopping. One mile to the west of Galt Junction, we find 5356 of the P2 class with an extra east. This was the only locomotive in that class without a feedwater heater. Shortly after extra 5356 clears at Galt Junction, the westward parade starts, with P1 Mike 5191 leading the way. Once again we see 5405. This locomotive remained in service until being stored serviceable in 1960 and was to be one of the last Canadian Pacific steam locomotives to be scrapped, this occurring in 1965. G1 Pacific 2233 is assisting Montreal Locomotive Works FA1 4020 up the 7-mile Milton Hill at Campbellville. 4020 was already 5 years old when photographed here in 1956 and remained in service until 1970 when she was retired following a head-on wreck at Keewatin, Ontario. Pacific 2203 assists Mike 5118 west at Campbellville in December of 1956. It's January 2nd, 1957. And Pacifics 1221 and 2409 have number 21, the Chicago Express, well in hand as they work west through Campbellville. 21 has officially been dieselized since 1954, but due to the impending firemen's strike, CP did not want diesels stranded at remote points, so steam was assigned. Here we see number 21 continuing west after the station stop at Galt Junction. Pacific 2203 is seen just departing Guelph with train 646 for the short 15-mile run to Galt Junction. This was the last train out of Guelph until the firemen's strike ended 9 days later on January the 11th, 1957. The enginemen who ran the assist engines, such as the G1 class Pacific seen here, were in a pool referred to as the Cockney Pool. This nickname probably dated back to the days when most of the enginemen were of English origin. The firemen on the assist engines were all spareboard men, and the assist pool was a training ground for the new men. The engineman would have to have the patience of Job, since it was possible to have a fireman with only a few weeks' service teaching a new man how to keep water and steam in the boiler. T1 Mikado 5135 is just cresting Hornby Dip, 27 miles west of Toronto, with 4th class train 54. The following 6 sequences are witness to the end of an era. The date is October 26, 1957, and train M233, a daily except Sunday mixed between Hamilton and Port Rowan, Ontario, climbs Hamilton Mountain for the last time. Ken Wheeler 1541 was the locomotive regularly assigned to the 63-mile run to the shores of Lake Erie, and she makes light work of train 233 as we see it passing through the towns of Caledonia and Hagersville. "1541 started life in 1910 as Canadian Northern Railway 1336. Her career ended shortly after this run at Canadian National's London Reclamation Yard. Notice the blue Canadian National Express truck leaving for its route after exchanging express packages with 233 at Jarvis. Here, the train joins the Canadian National Wabash Main Line for a few miles, until branching off at Simcoe for her Port Rowan destination. Our last view of Mix 233 is near Simcoe, Ontario. Stratford, Ontario, was well known for its extensive shops used for the maintenance and overhaul of many of Canadian National's steam locomotives. Here we witness an Atlantic region McAdoo, the 3199, just returning to service after heavy shopping at the Stratford back shops. The date is March 8, 1958, and 3199 has been assigned to double head with Northern 6151 on time freight 400 to Toronto. $31.99 finishes switching her van onto the train, then heads up the yard to be joined by the 6151, soon seen backing off the shop lead. "7 miles to the east, the pair have train 400 well underway as they blast through Shakespeare, Ontario on this bitter March day. Bayview and Hamilton Junction, located 37 miles west of Toronto, have always been favorite spots for the Southern Ontario rail fan, and these next scenes will easily demonstrate why. At Bayview, Canadian National lines from Hamilton and London converge with the Toronto Main Line, while 4/10 of a mile further west, at Hamilton Junction, Canadian Pacific's tracks from Hamilton and Galt Junction join the CN line. Until the late 50s, Canadian National passenger trains to and from London would run into Hamilton Station, 3 miles to the west of Bayview. Depending on their direction of travel, trains had to make a reverse movement, either into or out of Hamilton. U2, 6228, with train 83, has just completed this procedure and is now westbound to London and Windsor. With all these extra movements, Bayview was definitely a busy spot. Helpers were often needed for the climb from Bayview to Copetown, as seen here with Jeep 4225 assisting Northern 6253. After completing this chore, the 4225 would cut off and return light to Bayview. We momentarily returned to Galt Junction to catch Canadian Pacific 2238 and 5370, departing on an extra west to London. Once again at Hamilton Junction, and Canadian National U2, 6233, is passing the tower with train 83, an all-stop local to Windsor. .5702, one of Canadian National's 5 K5 class Hudsons, is seen just out of Bayview with train 75, the Forest City. Canadian Pacific Royal Hudson 2857 heads east out of Hamilton with a Toronto-bound passenger extra. Number 83 with the 6200 passes 2 more Northerns on a caboose hop at Bayview in March of 1958. Canadian Pacific P1 5135 is just to the north of Hamilton Junction, with an extra north to Guelph Junction. CN Northern 6163 appears to be right on the 10-mile-per-hour speed limit for the Bayview interlocking as she heads south on the Dundas subdivision. One of Canadian Pacific's G5 Pacifics, 1222, has just entered the CP Hamilton subdivision with a passenger extra to Hamilton. Once again, the 80-inch drivers of CN 5702 make easy work of train 75, the Forest City, to London. This locomotive is preserved at the Canadian Railway Museum at Delson, Quebec. Diesels have now started to show up as assist engines on the Galt subdivision, as seen by GP9 8701 assisting extra 5187 West at Campbellville. Bayview Junction is once again our location as U2 class Northerns pass with a steady parade of Canadian National varnish. Delivery by Canadian Locomotive Company of number 6100 in June of 1927 started CN's love affair with these dual-purpose locomotives, and it lasted until 1944, when the last one, 6264, was delivered. CN's fleet of Northerns numbered 203 to make up the largest ownership anywhere. These locomotives were equally at ease handling either 16-car passenger trains or 80-car freights, and were certainly the favorites of Canadian National engine crews. Luckily, 5 of the Canadian National Northerns have been preserved, including 6200, which is now at the Canadian Museum of Science and Technology in Ottawa. Our last look at Bayview has CP 1271 eastbound to Toronto, with an afternoon passenger extra. The location is now Bolton, 22 miles to the north of Toronto on the Canadian Pacific McTier subdivision, and RS3 8456 approaches assisting H1 Hudson 2814 on second-class train 953. The assist engine would cut off at Bolton, while 2814 would work 2 divisions north to Cartier, Ontario. Now a G5 class Pacific follows 953 north with a train of grain empties for Port McNichol. Just out of the General Motors diesel plant, 75 miles to the west at London, week-old GP9 8684 assists Mike 5118 on the Milton Hill in July of 1957. A few minutes later, Sister 8683 approaches with another Mike, this time number 5405, from the P2 class. Royal Hudson 2857 lifts the overnight New York to Toronto train number 712 out of Oakville. This locomotive made a celebrated last run by hauling an Upper Canada Railway Society fan trip from Toronto to Port McNicoll and back on June 5, 1960. Unfortunately, though, she was not preserved, and the end came on April 10, 1961. The Pacific and Mike joined forces westbound at Campbellville, Ontario. Temiskaming, Quebec, on the branch from Mattawa to Anglier, is our location now. Here, N4 class consolidation, 3954, will depart the station, set off for Caboose, and head to a true Branchline coaling facility. When the servicing is complete, she will back out to reclaim her van, then head off to complete the run north. North Bay has always been a busy spot for CP, and just west of town we see Pacific 1266 on the Sturgeon Falls way freight. Soon after the passage of the way freight, Mike 5403 heads west with a Sioux freight. Note the extra piping from the top right of the boiler for use in snow melting service. Now, Pacific 2421 heads east to North Bay. 2421 is distinct in that she has a gray-blue boiler jacket, yet is painted in the basic black scheme. "2421 is now seen after being readied for its next assignment at the North Bay shop. The engineman completes his inspection. Then noted Canadian rail photographer, the late Fred Sankoff, comes by to give her the once-over. The next scenes of Canadian Pacific Jubilee, number 3000, were taken at Windsor, Ontario, on October 19th and 26th, 1957. The 3000 is resting in the company of 3-week-old GP9, 8700, before heading off to ready train 634 for departure. 634 is a Windsor to London local, scheduled to run ahead of number 22, the Chicago Express. The local did 22's head-end work, thus allowing the express a faster running time. The 3000s were designed by Canadian Pacific's Chief of Motive Power, H.B. Bowen, in 1936, a time when the world was enamored with streamlining. Montreal Locomotive Works built 5 of these beauties, and with their 80-inch drivers, they became real speedsters on short, light passenger trains. Note the Canadian Pacific diesel with the Chesapeake and Ohio caboose. Both railways share this yard, which is located just across the border from Detroit, the buildings of which can be seen in the background. In stark contrast to the 3000, Consul 3504 gets back to work now that 634 has cleared the Windsor yard. The 3000's sister, the 3003, attained the fastest official speed record ever recorded by a steam locomotive in Canada by hauling a test train through St. Telesphore, Quebec at 112.5 miles per hour on September 18, 1936. One note of interest with these locomotives is that the main rod drives the front axle. While this presented no problems when running forward, buckled rods resulted if the engineman tried to back up with more than 5 cars. Canadian Pacific H1 class Hudson 2806 is southbound near Palgrave, Ontario with train 954. Royal Hudson 2825 is just departing Hamilton Junction for Toronto. Notice the beaver shield missing from the side of the cab. Pacific 2464 is seen heading north on second-class train 953, just to the north of Bolton, Ontario. April 27, 1958, finds Pacific 2332 on train 954, braking for a stop at Midhurst, Ontario, where it will get orders and take on water. 2332 had a career worthy of note. In 1938, she was fitted with an automatic train control, extra pilot steps, and a higher pressure train line, all items required by U.S. authorities to enable the locomotive to be used in international service between Toronto and Buffalo. She remained in this service, along with 3 other Pacifics, until 1948, when she was reassigned to the Toronto-Lambton Freight Pool. On July 19, 1959, 2332 teamed up with Pacific 2214 to haul an NRHS special between Streetsville, Galt Junction, and Hamilton. She saw little service after this trip and was scrapped October 26, 1961. In order to better utilize track time, the dispatcher has coupled a beaten turn with RS-11 8769 van to the head end of 954 for the 39-mile run to Toronto. Beaton was often used for the storage of freight cars, and the 8769 would have brought a bunch north before we see it here heading home. Back at Hamilton Junction, and CP 5153 heads an extra east, while shortly afterwards, Train 83 arrives from Toronto with U2 6200. U-26239 heads south through Ridgeway, Ontario in June of 1958. Another U-2, this time 6256, is hauling a dead Jeep, the 4819, south of Thorold, Ontario, en route to Fort Erie. Approaching now is one of Canadian Pacific's prettiest passenger trains. Number 303, a Wednesday and Saturday, summer-only train, is heading from Toronto to Port McNicoll to connect with the Canadian Pacific passenger steamers Assiniboia and Keewatin, which travel west to the twin cities of Port Arthur and Fort William, now known as Thunder Bay. The location is now Kenora, Ontario, a division point on Canadian Pacific's transcontinental main line. CP Royal Hudson 2851 is arriving with train 53 from Fort William to Winnipeg. Note the raised numerals on 2851's running boards. 2851 and 2850 are the only two Royal Hudsons with this feature, having received them when assigned to Royal Train Service in 1939. 2851 pulled the pilot train, while 2850 hauled the Royal Consist, the entire 3,224 miles from Quebec City to Vancouver. It was because of this outstanding performance that Canadian Pacific's H.B. Bowen, their designer, sought and received royal consent to name the 45 semi-streamlined 464s the Royal Hudsons. We now head west to the Prairie Provinces of Manitoba and Saskatchewan. Canadian Pacific N2 Consolidation 3602 is in work train service at Oakbank, Manitoba. The double tender allows the locomotive to work longer stretches on the work trains without having to run for water. "2851 is encountered again, this time on train 54 from Winnipeg to Fort William. The following scenes show Canadian Pacific G3 class Pacifics on manifest and grain empty extras westbound at Kemnay, Manitoba. Notice the 2373 has its cab beaver shield missing. All three of these Pacifics are oil burners. and this class was the basic freight engine for Canadian Pacific on the prairies. Canadian National J4 Class Pacific 5088, which started life as Canadian Government Railways 466 in 1916, rolls to a stop at Dugald, Manitoba, with mixed train 216. The 5088 now passes us with 216 on its way from Winnipeg to Reddit, Ontario. The next 9 scenes were taken at St. James Tower, a busy interlocking to the west of Winnipeg in August of 1957, and our first train is a way freight with CP Consul 3681. CNS2, the 3529, a Mikado fresh out of Transcona shop, heads east to Winnipeg. CN 10-wheeler 1330 heads west with train 47 to Russell, Manitoba. CN J4 Class Pacific 5117 waits at St. James for regular trains to clear before proceeding on a caboose hop to Brandon. This locomotive saw Royal Train service throughout British Columbia during 1939. First 12, a Saskatoon to Winnipeg local, passes with U1 6074. Shortly afterwards, number 17, with the 5002, which started life as Canadian Northern Railway 702 in 1913, passes en route to Virden, Manitoba. With the regular trains clear, 5117 now heads to Brandon. S1 Mikado, the 3318, works west to Rivers with a train of grain empties. Train 63 from Winnipeg to Flin Flon now approaches with an immaculate U1, number 6049. Further west, at Portage-la Prairie, Canadian Pacific's train number 2, the Canadian, passes on its way from Vancouver to Toronto and Montreal. Entering service on April 24, 1955, the Canadian soon became known as one of the world's finest trains. Watch closely as the parked car passes, and you'll notice a CN freight heading west out of Portage. CP 1272 has the Brandon to Broadview Way freight well underway at Fleming, Saskatchewan. Train 137, the Brandon to Estevan local, passes us at Kemnay, Manitoba. Canadian National S2 Mike 3579 is marshalling its train at Rivers, Manitoba in August of 1957. Notice the white sediment under the firebox. This is caused by the extremely alkaline prairie water as it blows back from the blow-off cock. .3579 is now seen departing Rivers with a westbound extra to Melville, Saskatchewan. One of Canadian Pacific's only two northerns, the 3101, departs Austin, Manitoba with train 58. Both 3100 and the 3101 are preserved, the 3100 in Ottawa and the 3101 at Regina. Our last prairie action sees G3 Pacific 2376 on an extra west at Austin, Manitoba. Once again, we are north of Toronto on the Canadian Pacific McTier sub as Pacific 2398 heads south with 4th class train number 82. The first scene was north of Bolton, while the second just to the south of the town. Pacific 2231 is seen working south with the McTier way freight. The boat train, number 303, passes on the first run of the 1957 season. Second-class train 953 with the 2405 is being assisted to Bolton by Pacific 2228. An extra north is right behind, with Pacifics 2231 and 2403. 2231 is preserved at the Canadian Railway Museum at Delson, Quebec. After cutting off Helper 2231, we see the extra, just north of Bolton. With 953 and the extra gone, the southbounds arrive. The first is 948 with Mike 5460, followed closely by Train 82 with Hudson 2802. Royal Hudson 2838 rolls Canadian Pacific Train 712 from New York to Toronto through Oakville, Ontario. Right behind 712 is Canadian National Train 94, the Maple Leaf, from New York City, with U4 Northern 6402.